So today we're going to continue on with working class unrest, and we're going to talk about mostly labor unions. Now, if you remember from our last lecture, labor unions are groups of workers who have come together to get increased wages, shorter hours, better working conditions. And so today we're going to go through a whole series of labor unions or working groups that are trying to fix just those three goals. So the first one we have is the National Labor Union, 1866 to 1872. It's our first significant labor union in American history that is not some local thing, but is going to go across America, trying to unite workers in many different cities. So its goal is to organize skilled and unskilled workers. If you remember, we had talked about a skilled worker is somebody who has training that is hard to replace, and an unskilled worker is somebody that you could point to a machine and say, this is how you make that machine work, and that's the extent of their training. Normally, these two groups do not join in the same union, but the National Labor Union understands that as far as unions go, there's safety in numbers. The more people who join your union, the stronger it is, the more change you're going to be able to affect. And so they welcomed women. Women tended to be unskilled workers. Right out of the cult of domesticity, they're going to come to work because their family needs them to. So these are lower class women. And we're going to see them put in the union. Also, they're going to include African American workers. Some African Americans who were already in the North before the Civil War started, or a few who come to the North after the Civil War is over. We will see them as unskilled workers who are looking for higher paying, some industrial jobs, even though they're unskilled. But they're not going to welcome Chinese workers. There is just too much racism at this time, and people who are in the National Labor Union, they don't want to be in the same organization as Chinese workers. The action plan, all of the unions we're going to talk about today will go after their goals of getting higher pay, shorter hours, safer working conditions in a different way. The National Labor Union believes that the way to improve workers' lives is not necessarily through strikes. It is through legislation. It is banding their workers together, going to the voting booth, and voting on election day and trying to get politicians elected who are sympathetic to union workers. And so we see their most important thing is for the 8-hour day. That's going to be the holy grail of labor unions. They do have some success. Because of the National Labor Union's political pressure, the federal government is going to pass legislation that says for federal employees, now this is just for federal government workers, they're going to have the 8-hour day. And so the hope is that the federal government, if they do this, they will set a trend or set a precedent that private businesses will follow. Of course, private businesses don't want to do that, so is this just really just symbolic? Private businesses don't want to do the 8-hour day because then they'd have to hire a whole other shift of workers and go from 2 shifts of workers with 12-hour days to 3 shifts of workers with 8-hour days, and that would cost them more. So not a lot of success outside of this federal government legislation for their own employees. What we'll do the National Labor Union is often the case with unions, we have a panic in 1873. The economy goes south, it's bad, and so businesses start firing workers. Well, in that kind of a climate where there's an extreme surplus of workers and not that many jobs because factories are shutting down due to the panic, we see nobody wants to join a union because if you join a union, then you risk getting fired and jobs are hard to come by in a panic. And also if you join a union, you're going to lose part of your paycheck to union dues. And so we see that as a recurring trend, depressions or recessions or panics is really hard on labor unions. And so that's why the National Labor Union ceases to exist in part. The next labor union we're going to see is the Molly Maguires. Now, the Molly Maguires are a group of Irish immigrant miners who work in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. We see a picture on the bottom right-hand corner. This is extremely dangerous work, long hours, very low pay, and in fact they get paid by the cartload. So a team of workers, a team of miners would go down into the mines with very little safety precautions because that would cost the mine money, and they will dig coal out of the earth, put it on a cart, and then take it back up. So these miners get paid by the cartload. That cart is weighed, every time they bring it up, and that's how they determine the miners' pay. So they're encouraged to work as fast as they can, which of course makes the work even more dangerous. The miners ask their bosses for safer working conditions. They ask them for shorter hours, more pay, and of course the mine owners, they say no. They just say go back into that mine and make us some money. And of course the government's not going to step in and regulate the business and say you've got to put in some safety precautions here for the miners. Not at this time, anyway. And so the Irish workers tried to create a union. They figure if we all join together, we can create a union and we can force the mine owners to give us our demands, especially safer working conditions. The owners hear that the miners, the Irish miners, are trying to create a union, and so they try to fire anybody who is an agitator, any worker who is trying to start this union. Now, the workers find out about this, and so the workers, what they do is, as you can see in the picture on the right-hand side, they start attacking the mine managers. The owners they can't get to, but they certainly will attack the people that the owners have hired to manage the mine, the supervisors. And we see them beating them up, clubbing them, trying to intimidate them into giving the union what the union wants. So what is the company to do? So the company, what they do is they go hire a private detective agency called the Pinkerton Detectives. And the Pinkerton Detectives have been around for a long time. They actually worked for the United States government in the Civil War as spies. And so these Pinkerton detectives, a couple of them go undercover, and they pretend to be Irish immigrants, and then they find out who the leaders are when they're undercover of these Molly Maguires, of these Irish miners who want to start a union. And once they find them out, then they go to the owners and they give them a list of names. These are the people that are leading the violence against our managers. These are the people who are trying to start the union. And so what the mine owners do then is they get the local government to arrest 24 of the Molly Maguires, the suspected radical leaders, and 10 of them are hanged. And they're hanged for beating up these mine managers and also creating a disturbance. It's a pretty severe punishment, but the mine owners certainly don't want a union forming in their mines because then they'd have to pay more money. And so here we see an example of the local government helping the mine owners out, being on the side of the owners by arresting these people and then killing them. Next, we get the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Just like we're going to talk about several unions at this time, during these notes we're going to talk also about some pretty famous strikes. In 1877, it's going to be the first major interstate strike in United States history, meaning it's going to affect not just like the Molly Maguires, one state, one mine. It's going to affect a whole bunch of workers across the eastern part of the United States. The causes of the strike were, in 1873, we had talked about there was a panic, and so the economy's not doing very well, and so railroad companies just aren't hauling as much freight. People aren't buying things, factories are shutting down, and so to cut costs, what the railroad companies do is they say, we are going to cut wages 10%. So we're going to lower the pay of workers 10% from what it was, which was already pretty low to begin with. Violence erupts in West Virginia. The railroad workers think you can't cut our pay. This is not fair. It's not our fault that the economy is bad. We barely have enough to survive anyway. And so we see violence erupt from these overworked, underpaid railroad workers. And so we see them lashing out, and they start to burn railroad property. They hope that this way they can get the railroad companies attention, and if we intimidate the company, maybe they'll give us our 10% of wages back. So they start to burn railroad cars. Now, railroad workers in other states find out about this, and I think, yes, let's do this too. And so we see this violence start in West Virginia and then spread throughout the eastern part of the United States. This basically halts railroad traffic in America because the railroads are being burned down, railroad stations, railroad cars, engines, and so the economy falls further into panic with the shutting down of transportation. Over 100 people die in the rioting, and of course millions of property of the railroad property is destroyed in the violence and the rioting. So the federal government sends in troops. Instead of taking the side of the workers, or instead of acting as an intermediary to try to figure out what's going on and solve this dispute, the federal government comes in and sends in troops. We see them in the picture, and they protect the railroad company's property. And they fire on any workers that try to stop the train or destroy property. So once again, we see this is not a time of laissez-faire. insofar as when there's a problem, the government will come in on the side of business. If this was truly an age of laissez-faire, government would say to businesses, look, we're not going to regulate you, but we're also not going to help you out. We're going to keep our hands truly off the economy and let you guys figure it out. But they don't do that. They come in on the side of business. So workers appeal to radical middle class. And so what we see, because of all of this violence, this certainly is going to have a negative effect on the middle class in America. They may have been sympathetic to the unions and the workers before the strike. Oh, these poor workers, they're working under these horrible conditions, they're not getting much pay, it's just been reduced. But when the workers resort to violence, we see this is going to be counterproductive with them on the middle class. In America, you need the middle class to be on your side if you want to affect political change. They're the vast majority of people who vote, so they have more control over the government. And so the unions did not help themselves with this rioting because it made the middle class think that these unions are just radicals and they can't be trusted. And so we see quotes like, this may be the beginning of a great civil war in this country between labor and capital. And so now we're worried about class warfare in America. It certainly seems that America is going down the road of being torn apart, not between North and South, but between the haves and the have-nots in the Gilded Age. Next labor union we're going to talk about is the Knights of Labor. The leader of the Knights of Labor, we see here in his wonderful mustache, is Terence Powderly. Make sure you know the leaders of these unions. And his goal is to create equal pay for skilled and unskilled workers, just like the National Labor Union. He's trying to bring together skilled and unskilled workers. So we see this in this Knights of Labor cartoon. We see all of these different workers coming together. We see miners, we see manufacturers, we see farmers. We see all of them coming together under one flag and trying to, get workers' rights for all of them. Again, the idea being the more people you have in your union, the more powerful it is. And so we also see them trying to bring in women into their union because those are mostly unskilled workers. Their action plan, unlike the National Labor Union, they're not going to try to control the government. They're not going to try to get pro-union politicians elected because they know that's really difficult in the Gilded Age. A lot of the politicians are controlled or influenced by big business. And so what they do is their goal is to have workers actually take over control of businesses, not in a violent way, not through riots, but actually pool their money together and then buy the company out or buy the factory out or the mine out from the owners. Their thinking is if the workers own the industry, if the workers own the factory or the mine, that they're going to give themselves better pay, safer conditions. And so that's the way to improve the workers' lives, not through the government, but through capitalism by just owning the companies. Not a lot of success in this because one, who says that the owner wants to sell the mine or the factory, and another one is we see too much disagreement between skilled and unskilled workers. Let's say that the workers do come together and pool their money. The skilled workers are going to say, okay, we have skill, we want more pay, and the unskilled workers say, no, we want the pay to be equal, we're in a union. And so this friction between skilled and unskilled workers will really limit the success of the Knights of Labor. The middle class will also think that the Knights of Labor is a radical organization. Now, they're really not. They want to work within the system of capitalism, just have the workers in charge by buying some of the factories. But in the public's mind, we're in 1886, we're going to have a Knights of Labor rally. It's in Chicago at a place called Haymarket Square. And so the Knights of Labor have this rally all day long. Their speeches. This is why the Knights of Labor are good. They're trying to convince people in Chicago to join the Knights of Labor. And when the meeting is over and it's kind of wrapping up and people are drifting off into the night, we see a couple of anarchists show up and they throw bombs into the crowd of the police that were there watching the rally. And the police fire into the crowd and some of the anarchists fire into the police. And so we see policemen killed, we see spectators killed, and then rioting commences throughout some of Chicago. And in the public's mind, this was the Knights of Labor that started this, even though it wasn't. It was anarchists who had infiltrated the crowd. The public blames the Knights of Labor, and so now the middle class thinks that the Knights of Labor is a radical organization. They're anarchists, and so we see them they're going to be attacked in the courts. They're going to see that people around America are not going to want any kind of a Knights of Labor representative to come into their community because they're viewed as anarchists and radicals. And then what does them in as well, besides the Haymarket Square riot and the negative response to that, is we have another panic, this one in 1893. Remember, we tend to get economic downturns every 20 years. And just like the National Labor Union, the Knights of Labor, we're going to see workers laid off. They're not going to join a union if they don't have a job, or they're not going to join a union if they're afraid of losing their job, which is sometimes employers will do if they find out you're in a union. Jobs are scarce. And so we see the Knights of Labor done in by those two things, the panic and then negative reaction to the Haymarket Square riot. Next, the American Federation of Labor, a very successful union. You can see that in the date. It started in 1886, and it goes all the way to today. There's still the American Federation of Labor, or as it's more commonly called, the AF-L. The leader is Samuel Gompers, another great mustache. And Samuel Gompers, his goal is he's trying to unite all skilled workers and unskilled workers only. He does not believe that if you try, he believes that if you try to unite skilled and unskilled workers, as we've seen before, that's not going to be successful. And his goal is to be successful, obviously. He also believes that unskilled workers don't have a chance of winning strikes because they're easily replaced. They don't have a skill. So the only real successes to be gained, according to Samuel Gompers, is to organize, and organize means unionize, skilled workers. If they go on strike, they're hard to replace because they do have a skill, and so the union has more success when they go on strike of actually getting what the workers want. So what's his action plan? It's not about trying to control the government. It's not about trying to give workers control of factories. His plan is very hands-on. It's very practical. He says, we're going to go on strike. We're not going to try to take over the business or the government. We're just going to go on strike, and we're going to work with owners of factories and mines, and we're going to say, look, we're going to come to you collectively. We want you to give us more pay or shorter hours or better working conditions, and if you don't, we're going to go on strike. And we know it's hard to replace us because we're skilled workers. So because of this, because they're skilled, we see that they have a tremendous amount of success. So they really just focus on contracts, the tangible things that workers want: better pay, shorter hours, safer working conditions. They do attain new contracts in a whole series of industries for workers. Now, up above, I called this an umbrella organization, and what that means basically is the AFL is like this super union that a whole bunch of smaller skilled unions join, whether it's the Cigar Rollers Association or the Shoemakers Association or whatever. Any kind of career or skill that a worker has, maybe they're a plumber, and so they join the Plumbers Union. All of these smaller unions join together under the big blanket term AFL because there's strength in numbers. And so what happens is, let's say that the Cigar Rollers of America go on strike. How can they be successful? Because not only do those cigar rollers go on strike, shutting down the cigar factory, but then we have sympathy strikes spread across America, where fellow members of the AFL who may be in a different industry, let's say they're shoemakers, they'll also go on strike. And so the owner of that business will go to the owner of the cigar business and say, look, you've got to end this strike. Now I'm suffering because you're not giving your employees much pay. And so we see they're using peer pressure between factory owners to try to solve their strikes. Or sometimes what we'll do is we'll see boycotts. Instead of going on strike in a sympathy strike, maybe the Shoemakers of America, their union will refuse to buy any cigars from a company that doesn't treat their workers well, which will, of course, cut into the cigar makers' business. And so we see all across America, if you're a member of the AFL, when you go on strike, not only will other people go on strike alongside you, but they'll even boycott the business that you work in, which will put pressure on your employer to end the strike favorably for you. The Homestead Strike, our next big strike. So we had the Great Railroad Strike earlier, and so here's another one also associated with a panic. It's the Homestead Strike of 1892. Homestead is in Pennsylvania, and it is one of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills. These workers, it sometimes is described as working in hell. These workers, as you can see in the picture, now this is a modern picture when the worker has some more modern protection to keep him safe from all of this tremendous heat. You see these workers in Carnegie steel mills at the time working 12-hour days, 7 days a week. They don't get any days off. And they're working in very dangerous conditions. If you imagine you're that worker but without the modern equipment, these guys get burned all the time. They suffer from heat exhaustion. There's all kinds of machines flying around. To make this steel, they get hit. They get knocked into a vat of liquid metal. And so it's very, very dangerous job with long hours and, of course, very little pay. And so the workers talk about forming a union. Well, Andrew Carnegie, he finds out through some spies that his workers are trying to form a union, and he certainly doesn't want that to happen. He'll have to pay the workers more, have to hire new shifts, he'll have to put in some safety precautions. And so Andrew Carnegie, who's out of the country at the time, he gets his right-hand man, a guy by the name of H.C. Frick, and he says, look, when I come back, I want this solved. I want you to stop this union from forming. And so what H.C. Frick does is he puts a fence around his factories and he locks the workers out. He says to the workers, you guys can't come back on the job until you stop this silly talk of forming a union. And so he fires them, basically. He locks them out. And then, of course, Carnegie and Frick don't want their steel mills to be sitting there without workers. And so while this lockout is going on, they want to hire replacement workers. Now, not a very nice term for replacement workers is scabs, but we're going to see them hire replacement workers to keep the steel mills going until the lockout has been resolved. So if you're a worker, let's say you're one of these workers and you're thinking about joining a union, forming a union, and Carnegie and Frick lock you out, that means you don't have access to your job, and so your family's going to starve. So you want this lockout to end quickly. And so what you do is if you see those replacement workers or scabs coming in to take your job, if you let them in the factory, there's no reason on the earth that Carnegie has to hire you back, because he's able to keep his mind going, and he'll just say you're fired, and he'll blacklist you and say you can't work anyplace else. And so we see the workers surround the steel mill, and they don't want to let the replacement workers in, because the minute replacement workers step in the factory, the locked out workers become irrelevant. And so we have this standoff going on. The factory is surrounded by the fence. Outside the fence are the locked out workers, and then trying to get into the factory are the replacement workers or the scabs. And so still the steel mill is not operating. They can't get the replacement workers in. And so Carnegie and Frick hire the Pinkerton detectives again, and it's their job to push through the crowds of locked out workers and get the replacement workers safely in the factory so the factory can start operating again. So we see this picture. We see the steel mill in the background. There's the fence around it. And then the mob that's surrounding the fence, that is the locked out workers who are angry. They don't want to let anybody in. If they can't get in, they don't want any other workers to get in. And so the barge you see there that's trying to get inside the factory, that is full of replacement workers or scabs who are trying to get into the factory to get the factory up and running again. And then on the barge, we see a bunch of men. Some of them are dying. They're the Pinkerton detectives. They're the private security force hired by Carnegie and Frick to safely get those replacement workers into the factory. And so we see violence erupting between the locked out workers and the replacement workers and the Pinkerton detectives. Eventually, so H.C. Frick goes to the governor of Pennsylvania and he says, look, we've got violence happening outside our factories. We gave you a lot of money to get elected. You need to do something. He says this to the governor. You need to call out the state militia and end this violence. Our factory isn't making any money. People are dying outside the factory. And so the state militia comes in and they force open the gates and they safely walk in the replacement workers. And so that pretty much busts up the lockout. Now, a lot of the workers who were trying to get a union, they know they'll never get their job back because they've just been replaced by the replacement workers. So once again, we see that, let me go back for a second. Once again, we see that the United States government, whether it's state or local, is taking the side of business. They're not keeping their hands off. They're coming in and actively helping out big business. Now, at the beginning of the strike, a lot of people across America were very sympathetic to the workers. They know that the conditions are bad in these locations. They think that the workers should get better pay and safer conditions and shorter hours. But what happens as the strike is going on, we see this violence going on that starts to turn the middle class off to the strike, and also, once again, an anarchist who's not really all that much associated with the locked out workers. He comes and he tries to assassinate H.C. Frick. He shoots H.C. Frick in the chest, but being a Carnegie man, H.C. Frick ignores the bullets, his bleeding chest. He grabs the assassin, he beats him up, and he sits on him until the police come. So pretty tough guy. But this assassination and the violence outside the factory convinced the public that this is a radical organization, these workers, and they shouldn't be supported. So once again, we see the workers, their strike, their lockout, or their cause is going to go for nothing. They're going to be replaced, and business goes on as usual. Next strike, the Pullman Strike, another famous strike in American history. Notice the Homestead Strike is 1892, and so the Pullman Strike is just the very next year. So as we go through the Gilded Age, we're seeing these big, massive, violent strikes get more and more and more common. And so the Pullman Palace Car, this is where it starts. The Pullman Palace Car Company, it is a factory that builds not steel this time, and it's not a mine this time. What it does is it builds palace cars. You can see a picture right here. It is luxury cars for railroad traffic. It's kind of like the limousine of the Gilded Age. If you're a rich person and you want to take a trip, you're going to buy yourself a palace car. It has, nice sleeping quarters. It's got a nice place for you to eat and drink and so forth and so on. And so these are luxury railroad cars. Now, the company has a factory, obviously, to build these cars, and the company also owns all of the houses around the factory. You can see some of them in the picture up above from the roof of the factory. That's the kind of vantage point of this picture. And so as agreement from working here, you see all of the houses in the background, those are all the employees where they live. And as a condition of employment, if you're going to work in the Pullman Palace Car factory, you have to work in one of these houses that is owned by the company. You also have to, by contractual agreement, have to shop in the company grocery store. And so let's kind of see how this plays out. On payday, the factory pays their workers, let's say $100 a month, although that's way overstated, but let's say it's a nice round number. They pay their workers $100 a month. And then the workers have to pay $50 of that right back to the company in rent, because the company owns all of the houses. And then the other $50 they spend at the company store. And of course, the company has jacked up their prices as much as they possibly can, and so they get the rest of their money back. So in a sense, the company is almost getting this work for free. And so that's what a company town is. It's when the company owns the factory, but they also own the houses and the stores that you have to live in and work in and shop in to work in the factory. Now, because of the Panic of 1893, not as many people are buying these expensive palace cars. And so what is the company to do? They don't want to lose money. They don't want to decrease their profits. And so, of course, what they do is they reduce wages, but they don't reduce the rent that they're charging for the homes, which means the only thing left for the workers is to slowly starve. They still have to pay their $50 a month in rent, but now let's say they're only getting $80 a month from the company, and so they have now substantially lost a big part of their food budget. And so these workers think this isn't fair, and of course, what do? They go on strike. Now, the leader of this strike is an up-and-coming union leader. His name is Eugene V. Debs. And here we see him addressing a crowd. And he says, look, we can't do this. This is unfair. The people in America who are the richest people, they have all the wealth, all the power. They control the government, and we are starving to death. And so he gets them to go on strike. Now, the people who work in this palace car company, they're part of a much bigger union that goes on sympathy strikes. And so if you're a railroad worker, let's say you don't have anything to do with actually making these railroad cars, but you do work on the railroads, and so you hook and unhook cars, you work on the engines, those kinds of things. And so we see railroad workers, they feel sorry for these factory workers, and so they go on sympathy strike, which means that they refuse to handle Pullman palace cars to show their support for their fellow factory workers. And so when a Pullman palace car train comes in, they refuse to hook or unhook it to another car, whether it be a coal car or a freight car or whatever. And so rails traffic in America, again, comes to a stop, harming the economy. And the union's approach to this is, if we all are in this together, if we all join together as workers, we'll shut down the economy of the United States, and factory owners will have to listen to us. The government will have to listen to us, and they'll help the Pullman palace car people. Of course, that doesn't happen. The Pullman palace car says to the United States government, you've got to do something about this. And so the federal government responds, and they say that they're by law saying that you have to attach the Pullman palace cars to U.S. mail cars. And so now if you don't do that, if you're on sympathy strike and you're refusing to attach the Pullman palace car to a mail car, well, now you've committed a felony. You are hampering the delivery of the mail, and that is breaking a federal law. And so this is how the government is trying to stop these sympathy strikes. It forces railroad workers to actually have to work with Pullman palace cars and attach them, reestablishing railroad traffic. In addition to that, the Attorney General of the United States issues an injunction against the strike. So attaching the Pullman Palace cars to mail cars is going to address the sympathy strikes, but what about the original strike itself, the workers striking against the Pullman Palace car company? And so the Attorney General steps in and says, through the courts, you cannot go on strike. I'm putting an injunction on the strike. Workers must go back to work. Well, Eugene V. Debs says, this is America. We have rights. You can't force us to go back to work. And so he says to the workers, don't go back to work, break the law, break the injunction. So the United States government, the Attorney General, they say, well, Eugene V. Debs is guilty of leading the strike. He broke the injunction. And so they send Eugene V. Debs to jail. And he's sitting in jail because he told people not to go to work. And so we see once again the United States government coming down on the side of the factory instead of the worker. In addition to that, President Cleveland will send in federal troops to end the strike. And so not only are we ending the strike by attaching mail cars to Pullman cars and using the injunction, but we're actually using physical violence to end the strike. The United States government comes in and says, you must go back to work. Here are some troops, and they will make you go back to work or handle these palace cars. And so we see the government sending in troops once again on the side of big business. Debs is sent to jail. Next. So these are all unions we've talked about so far and strikes. Well, let's pretend that you believe that unions are never going to change America. And so what we need to do is, like the National Labor Union, let's change things through politics. And so we see a new party be created in America. It's one of those third parties. It is the Socialist Party. And still sitting in jail, the leader of the party is Eugene V. Debs, and he's going to be the leader of this party from jail. And so he's also going to be running for the presidency as a socialist while in jail. And so, again, we see third parties in American history when there's a big issue and neither party is addressing that issue. Democrats and Republicans are both tied up with big business at the point. They still get a lot of support from them. And so nobody is really trying to look out for the interests of the worker and regulate business. And so Eugene V. Debs tries to rally the workers and say, let's create a political party, the Socialists. And the goal of the Socialists, right, is to have government ownership of many industries. Not all industries, that would be communism, but some key industries. And so he says what we need to do is we need to have the workers in control of the government, and if the workers are in control of the government, then the government will actually own the railroad factories. The government will own the food manufacturers, industries that people need that are essential to survive. The government will own electric companies, things that we need to heat and house our homes or get to work. And so if the government owns these industries, not private people, then we'll see the workers will finally be taken care of because the people control the government in this democracy, and then the government controls the industry to look out for the workers' welfare. And so we see the Socialist Party, workers of the world unite. We're trying to get all socialists around the world to unite together, but especially in the United States. And so we see this will also, they believe, help consumers. If the government controls the local electric factory or power plant or water plant, then they're going to lower their prices because they don't have to make a profit that's owned by the government. And so we see consumers benefit with lower prices. And we see workers benefit because they're going to be given a decent wage or given better hours or safer working conditions. Success of the Socialist Party. As you can imagine, people who vote socialist are typically low-class workers who are maybe union members, and they see this is a good solution to get them what they want because the government's not going to change unless the workers take it over. And so in 1900, when he first runs, he only gets 4,000 votes for president, Eugene V. Debs. So a very minor party. But then we look at just 4 years later, he gets 400,000 votes. In 1920, he gets 900,000 votes, almost 1 million votes. And so we see over time, as workers are still not helped, as their lives are still miserable and their working conditions are bad, people become more and more desperate and they become more and more radical. So instead of just joining a union or going on strike, now they're advocating government control, worker control of the government. And so that's certainly more radical. Even 33 major cities in America are going to have socialist mayors. And of course, these are mostly cities in the Northeast where there's lots of factories. Supporters, who is a socialist? I said obviously people who are labor unions. Immigrants tend to be socialist at this time for two reasons. One, they're factory workers, and so they think that this is a good thing for them. And two, socialism is big in Europe at this time, so they were already socialists actually before they even came to America. So they join the Socialist Party when they get here. Intellectuals, too. We see people who have advanced educational degrees, doctorates. They look at this and they think, though, this is a valid way to make America better. They see trouble on the horizon, they see class warfare, and they think this is a way to solve that class warfare. Give the workers what they want so we don't have all this civil war interrupting America between the rich and the poor. And we also see farmers join this. We'll talk more about them later, but farmers want a government in the Southwest, we're talking Arizona, New Mexico, because they want a bigger, stronger government that can start building irrigation projects. The Southwest is very dry, and they're hoping that if the government gets big enough and controlled by the people, they will spend money to help the common man out, including farmers. Decline. The Socialist Party will last until about World War I. And at that point, it'll seem like it's unpatriotic to be a socialist. We'll talk more about that later, but socialists are going to be targeted by the government. They're going to be targeted by Americans because the socialists they're against World War I. Socialists believe that World War I is a war created by capitalists to benefit capitalists, because who was going to make it rich off of all those government orders for guns and bombs and World War I tanks and those kinds of things? And so they think that the war is created by capitalists to benefit capitalists, and who will do the fighting and dying in the war, not the capitalist, but the common man. And so we see that they are certainly against the war, and so they're now seen as unpatriotic, and they will be targeted, and the Socialist Party will certainly weaken after World War I. Our next party, getting even more radical, is the International Workers of the World, or sometimes called the IWW or the Wobblies. They're from 1905 to the 19-teens, again, about World War I, and they're more radical. Their leader is a guy by the name of Big Bill Haywood. Here he is here, big giant of a man, one glass eye, a tough man. He is a communist. So when you think of the Wobblies or the International Workers of the World, they are communists, so even more radical than Eugene V. Debs and the socialists. So their goal is to have government ownership of not just some industries, but all industries. They want the workers of the world to unite. They want them to take over the government, and then the government will take over all private property and control everything. And so that they think this will help workers, because then the people will control the government, and the government then will make sure that everybody's paid equally, that there'll be no sick because everybody will get health care, there'll be no class warfare because everybody's going to be in the same class. And so we see this as kind of a utopian dream to help workers get all the things they want. So in the picture, we see the IWW. We'll talk more about industrial unionism together, but that basically means uniting all of the workers in an industry, no matter whether you're skilled or unskilled, and it's going to kill capitalism. Right? Because capitalism, in its clutches, we see that capitalism causes poverty on the right, child labor. I talked about its association with war, wage slavery. We're seeing that we're treating these workers in factories as slaves, maybe as we had talked about in the Pullman Strike. And so this is a propaganda poster by the communists to say that this is the way to make everybody's lives better, by having the workers kill capitalism and take over control of the government. So who tends to be communists? Really, they're the most desperate people in America, the people who are suffering the most, who have some of the most dangerous jobs. People working in mines tended to be Wobblies because they have very dangerous jobs, high employee mortality and injury rate. Lumberjacks also in the West, very dangerous jobs. So we see that the Wobblies, the communists at this time, were very strong out West. And then also some Eastern immigrants moving in because communism is on the rise in Eastern Europe. And so a lot of these Eastern European immigrants who are coming into America bring their communism with them. Success, very little. The communists are just too radical for most Americans because a lot of their strikes that they lead will result in violence. The most famous example here in our area is the Ludlow massacre here in Colorado. It's a bunch of workers who are in Ludlow, Colorado. They're going on strike because they have unsafe working conditions. Big Bill Haywood and the Wobblies come in to lead the strike. This freaks the mine owners out and the government of Colorado. Oh my gosh, we have communists in Colorado. And so we see that the state of Colorado and local police officers. They burned down the striking workers' houses, killing killing 19 people, including some children that were burned in some of these fires that were set by the local authorities. And so we see violent strikes erupt, and that is associated with the communists. And so a lot of people just will not join the communists because they're just seen as too radical, too dangerous. And eventually they will be declined because the same as the socialists, they are against World War I. They see World War I as a plot by the capitalists in the world to get rich off of government contracts for the war while the poor people die in the war. And so they will be targeted by the United States government. In fact, Big Bill Haywood, American citizen, is chased out of the United States, expelled for his political beliefs, and he eventually ends up in the Soviet Union. So let's go back. So that will wrap it up for part 2 of worker unrest, where we talk mostly about labor unions and strikes. We have one more section to go, and that will deal with urbanization.